My parents kicked me out for my brother and his pregnant girlfriend to take my room, then called me 3 months later to replace him after he disappeared. I come from a lower income class family where my life was anything but easy. Growing up, me and my brother, Kevin, didn't have much at all. My dad worked in a factory, and whatever money he earned was often swallowed up by his addiction to substances. My mom, on the other hand, worked as a cashier. Her job didn't bring in much, and she had to deal with a lot of rude customers, so she would frequently smoke or get drunk every night. As you can probably imagine, the little money that came into our household was spent on their expensive and destructive habits rather than on taking care of me and my brother. Life at home was rough. We never had proper food in the house. There were days when our cupboards were practically bare and we had nothing to eat. Clean clothes were a luxury we rarely had. Our beds were just old, dirty mattresses thrown on the floor, and the little furniture we did have was either thrifted or picked up from someone's backyard after it had been thrown away. It wasn't uncommon for us to go without basic necessities, and the house often felt more like a place of survival than a home. If you are wondering, why wasn't CPS ever contacted, it's because even the town we lived in wasn't much better. It was the kind of place where parents neglecting their kids was almost normal, so my brother and I didn't really have a way out. We were surrounded by families who were just as lost in their own struggles, and it seemed like no one really cared about their kids. My parents certainly didn't. They never bothered to check on us if we went to school every day, let alone how we were doing in our classes. It was as if our education, our future, just didn't matter to them. They did not care if we had any dinner before going to sleep or if we needed any medication when we fell ill. Mom and Dad also had a lot of arguments, and those arguments could sometimes turn violent. During those times, I would hide in my room, trying to escape the yelling and the crashing sounds that came from downstairs. During those dark moments, Kevin would often come into my room. We would sit together and put on music, turning up the volume just loud enough to drown out the shouting and lose ourselves in the songs. It was our way of coping, a small escape from the reality of our lives. This neglect by our parents took its toll on me and my brother. We learned to rely on each other a lot and to fend for ourselves. Kevin was always the one who tried to keep me focused on the future, even when our present was so difficult. He used to tell me to keep my head down and study hard, reminding me that if I worked for it, I could grow up and create a different life for myself, far away from the struggles we were living through. Kevin was also more academically inclined than I was, and he always seemed to have a clear plan in his mind. He would talk about his dream of going to college and making something of himself, breaking free from the cycle that our parents were trapped in. Over the years, as Kevin started excelling more and more in his studies at school, something unexpected happened. People in our church began to notice and would often come up to my parents, telling them how well their son was doing. For a family like ours, where academics had never been a focus and where our parents had never shown any real interest in our schooling, this sudden attention was a big deal. It was almost as if a light bulb went off our parents' heads. They realized that, for the first time in their lives, they had something to brag about. And that something was my brother, Kevin. This was when the favoritism began. My parents, who had never cared enough to ask about our grades or whether we even went to school, suddenly started taking notice of Kevin's achievements. They quickly latched onto his success, parading it around to our relatives and neighbors like it was their own accomplishment. They acted like Kevin was their prized possession, showing him off to anyone who would listen. They would go on and on about how well their son was doing, almost as if his achievements could somehow wash away the reputation of their years of neglect. Kevin, of course, started enjoying the attention. I couldn't blame him for that. For the first time, both of our parents were actually interested in his life, and they were proud of him in a way that they had never been before. It was a stark contrast to the way things had always been, and I understood why he would soak it all in. After years of being ignored or dismissed, having our parents finally take an interest in him must have felt like a breath of fresh air. But what started as pride in Kevin's achievements quickly turned into my parents comparing me with him. My mother, in particular, began to taunt me if my grades weren't as good as Kevin's. She would tell me how I needed to work harder, and how I should be more disciplined and studious like him. No matter how much I tried to explain that I was doing my best, it was never enough for her. It didn't stop at just grades, either. Whenever I wanted to stay after school to play basketball with my friends and just relax, my parents suddenly had a problem with it. They would tell me to come home immediately and start working on my assignments, insisting that I needed to focus on my studies if I ever hoped to keep up with their darling Kevin. The pressure to live up to the expectations they had suddenly placed on me was overwhelming, and the joy I once found in things like basketball, music, or even just spending time with friends was being slowly erased by their constant demands for more, for better. As you can imagine, being constantly compared to my brother started to wear me down. At first, I tried to brush it off, telling myself that it wasn't really Kevin's fault because I knew he wasn't the one who had created this situation. But over time, things began to shift. The more attention Kevin got, the more he seemed to enjoy it, and that enjoyment started to change him. It wasn't long before he stopped spending time with me or standing by my side even if I had any legitimate complaints about our parents. Instead of supporting me like he used to, he began to echo their sentiments, telling me that I was overreacting, that I should stop complaining about them, and that our parents weren't as bad as I made them out to be. Hearing this from Kevin, the one person who used to understand and support me, made me start to doubt myself. I began to wonder if maybe he was right, if I really was just overthinking everything. But, slowly the blatant favoritism of my parents towards Kevin became even more clearer. For example, whenever my dad received his salary, Kevin would go to him and talk about how he needed new books and pens for school. Without hesitation, my dad would hand him money to buy any school supplies he needed. But when I would ask for the same things, my dad would refuse. He'd say that I could use Kevin's old worn-out books or discarded supplies instead. If I protested about how unfair this was, he would argue that he didn't have enough money for both of us and Kevin needed to be looked after more than me. It wasn't just about school supplies, either. My mom suddenly had an interest in cooking meals for my brother and she would only make meals that he liked. It didn't matter if I liked or disliked the food, what mattered was that it pleased my brother. It was incredibly frustrating and hurtful to be told that my needs were less important simply because I wasn't Kevin. These small gestures kept adding up, each one a constant reminder to me that Kevin was the one who mattered more, in our parents' eyes. Meanwhile, Kevin was also beginning to believe that he was somehow more deserving of it and didn't protest against the favoritism. And that realization hurt more than anything else. It felt like I was losing my brother, the person who was always there for me. And with Kevin no longer on my side, I felt completely alone in my struggles. The once strong bond we shared was breaking down, replaced by a growing resentment and sadness that I didn't know how to cope with. When Kevin got accepted into a good college with a full scholarship because of his academic achievements, I was genuinely happy for him. It was a moment of pride for our family, and I was excited to see him finally get the recognition he deserved. My parents, eager to celebrate Kevin's success, decided to take him out for a special dinner. It was a big deal for them, a chance to show him how proud they were. I remember asking if I could join, wanting to be part of the celebration, but they told me this dinner was just for Kevin. It stung to hear that, and what hurt even more was that Kevin didn't say anything in my defense. He didn't suggest that I should come along or make any effort to include me. I waited, hoping he would speak up for me like he used to, but he stayed silent. It was at that moment that I realized that Kevin clearly liked being the center of attention and I wasn't a priority in his life anymore. I didn't want to fight with them and spoil his night, so I let my brother and my parents have a good time on their own. Days later, when Kevin finally moved out to start college, the house felt strange and empty. Now that it was just me and my parents, the dynamic shifted back to what it had been before Kevin started to excel, except this time, it felt even worse. My parents, who had been so full of pride and energy when talking about Kevin, went back to ignoring me, just as they had before Kevin became their golden child. Without him around, they no longer had anything to brag about to their neighbors, and their interest in my life dwindled to nothing. The only time I heard any excitement in their voices was whenever Kevin called them from college. If the phone rang and it was Kevin on the other end, their eyes would light up. They'd suddenly become animated, eager to hear about his college life, his classes, and his friends. It was like he was the sun, and they revolved around him. If I tried to engage with my parents about my life at school, they would simply nod but not really seem interested or ask any questions. Even when I worked hard and started getting better grades, they would tell me how Kevin had scored better than me at my age, so I still wasn't doing enough. As if all wasn't hurtful enough, once I even overheard my parents talking in the living room about how relieved they were to have given birth to at least one child who was extraordinary. Hearing this felt like a punch to the gut. My dad remarked how my mom should have stopped getting pregnant after Kevin, and that if they hadn't had me, they could have given my brother a much more comfortable life. Those words shattered me. I had always known, deep down, that my parents favored Kevin, but to hear them speak so bluntly about how they wished I hadn't been born, it was unbearable. Was I really just an ordinary kid? Was I worth nothing to my parents? Their words made me feel like I was invisible, like I didn't matter at all. I started to wonder if all the things I had believed about myself were wrong, if maybe I really wasn't good enough, smart enough, or special enough to deserve their love. Living with that kind of doubt was suffocating. I started to feel like no matter what I did, I would never measure up to Kevin. It's a hard thing to carry, that kind of pain, and it left me feeling lost and alone in a way that I had never felt before. Luckily, during this difficult time, I met my current boyfriend, Nate. We were introduced through mutual friends. I remember one of the first things he ever said to me when we met was how beautiful but sad my eyes looked. That comment struck me because it felt like he could see something in me that most people overlooked. It was like he could see past the surface and understand the pain that I carried around with me. Nate came from a slightly better neighborhood than mine, and while our backgrounds were different, we quickly found common ground. What began as casual hangouts slowly turned into something more meaningful. Eventually, we went out on a date, just the two of us, and it was clear that we had something special. Our chemistry was undeniable. It felt like we just clicked in a way that I hadn't experienced before. Nate is my first real boyfriend, and while I know people often say that young love doesn't last, I can't help but hope that ours will be the exception. He's become such an important part of my life, and I really believe we have something worth holding on to. My boyfriend has played a huge role in helping me climb out of the dark place I was once in due to my parents' neglect. He's listened to me for hours, patiently hearing me out as I have talked about my family, my struggles, and the grief that I've carried for so long. He has never made me feel like my pain was too much or that I was a burden. With Nate, I've found a sense of hope and happiness that I didn't think was possible. This is how I got the motivation I needed to start working harder at school to improve my grades and even started doing part-time jobs just so I could save money and eventually move out of my parents' home. I knew that my struggle was long, but at least I had some kind of hope because of Nate. However, when I turned 18, life became even more difficult for me. My parents informed me that it was time for me to start paying rent to them. They had already noticed that I had been saving money from working at various part-time jobs over the years, and it seemed they now wanted a share of that money since I was legally an adult and they didn't have to support me. I tried to explain to them that I was still in the process of applying to colleges and that I was waiting to hear back from a few of them. Moving out was on my horizon, and I urged them to let me stay rent-free until then, but they wouldn't budge. They were adamant that they were done raising me and made it clear that if I wasn't going to start paying rent, then I needed to move out. I cried a lot over this because it felt so unfair. My brother Kevin had never been asked to pay rent after he turned 18, not even when he was living at home before heading off to college. This was just another reminder of the blatant favoritism that had always existed in my family. I felt betrayed. In the midst of all this, Nate suggested that I move in with him, explaining that his parents were okay with us living together. It was such a kind and generous offer, and it made me feel incredibly supported. But as much as I appreciated it, I wasn't ready. Moving in together felt like a huge step, and with everything that was happening, it seemed too soon, too rushed. I didn't want to jeopardize our relationship by moving in together before we were both ready, so I had to decline his offer. In the end, I had no choice but to start paying rent to my parents. It felt like a bitter pill to swallow, knowing that the very people who were supposed to support me were now demanding money from me instead. On top of the rent, I often found myself helping out with groceries and other bills around the house when they couldn't afford to pay them. Sometimes my dad would purposely delay paying these bills, using his money on drugs instead, just so he could turn around and ask me to cover the costs. It was clearly a manipulative move, and it hurt to see how little he cared about the burden he was placing on me. But I kept my mouth shut and did what they asked. I didn't want to start a fight with them, and I was afraid of the consequences if I refused. 3 months ago, Kevin called our family with some unexpected news. His girlfriend was pregnant. This came as a huge shock, especially since Kevin had only been dating this woman for a few months. This was a curveball none of us saw coming. Kevin was clearly stressed and desperate when he called. He explained that his girlfriend came from a very strict family that didn't support the idea of women getting pregnant before marriage. This is why his girlfriend needed a place to stay in peace during her pregnancy, and because house rents were already too high, he wanted to move back in with his girlfriend. Kevin also explained that he wanted to save money for raising his child instead of spending it all on rent and bills. He framed it as a temporary situation only, just until they could get on their feet and figure out a more permanent living arrangement. To my surprise, my parents wholeheartedly agreed to his request without even discussing it with me. I couldn't help but feel a bit confused and, to be honest, frustrated by their eagerness to accommodate him. After all, our house wasn't exactly spacious, and the idea of Kevin, his girlfriend, and their baby cramming into his old room seemed impractical, if not impossible. However, after the conversation with Kevin, the very next day, my parents sat me down to discuss how since Kevin and his girlfriend were moving in, they felt it was time for me to leave their house. I was taken aback and couldn't believe what I was hearing. When I asked them why, my dad casually remarked that they needed to convert my room into a nursery for the baby. I tried to argue with them, explaining how unfair this was. I pointed out that I had nowhere to go, and Kevin, as an adult, should be able to adjust to the situation without taking over my space. But my parents were unmoved. They instead accused me of being selfish and a freeloader, telling me that this was about their grandchild, and that I needed to stop arguing with them. It didn't matter to them that I was paying rent every month or that I was still trying to figure out my future. All they cared about was helping Kevin and making sure the baby had a room. My mom coldly informed me that I had just 1 week to pack up and move out. This time, since I had no other options left, I had to accept Nate's offer to move in with him. Of course, Nate was incredibly supportive, helping me pack up my belongings and move them into his truck. But as I packed, I couldn't hold back the tears. Despite everything, that house, especially my room, had been my sanctuary for so many years. It was the one place where I had grown up, where I had cried myself to sleep, where I had dreamed of a better life. Even though I hated so much about that house, losing my room felt like losing the last bit of stability I had. However, I had no other choice. Moving in with Nate was a big step, and at first, it wasn't easy for me to adjust. Nate's parents knew about my situation and seemed to genuinely feel bad for what I had been through. They tried to make me feel at home, and I appreciated their efforts, but it was still a difficult transition. Meanwhile, Kevin and his girlfriend moved into our parents' house, just as planned. Kevin called me only once after the move, probably out of obligation more than anything else. He asked me where I had gone, and I told him how our parents had essentially kicked me out to make room for him and his new family. I expected him to be surprised or at least concerned, but instead, he tried to downplay the situation. He suggested that what had happened was just a small sacrifice for the sake of his family, as if being forced out of my home was no big deal. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I pointed out how differently our parents had treated us over the years, how they had always favored him and ignored me, especially now. But instead of understanding, Kevin just accused me of being jealous and even told me to grow up, saying that I needed to stop being childish. That was the moment when I realized that any hope of having a normal relationship with him was gone. I had been holding on to the idea that maybe, deep down, he still cared about me as his sister, but his reaction made it clear that I was on my own. I decided then and there that I was done with him, and with our parents too. If they wanted to live happily ever after with their golden child and his girlfriend, then I wasn't going to stand in their way. I needed to move on and start focusing on myself once and for all, even if it meant cutting ties with them altogether. It's been 3 months since I moved in with Nate, and things have started to fall into place. Life has become a lot more stable, and I've started to settle into a routine living with him. Throughout all of this time, my parents have never once reached out to me. They haven't called to check on me, to see if I was okay, or to ask how I have been doing. Hence, today, out of nowhere, when I received a call from my mother I had no intention of answering. Later, during my lunch break, I saw several missed calls from both my parents and felt a pang of worry. I decided to call them back, and when I did, my dad informed me that Kevin and his girlfriend had apparently moved out of my parents' house secretly the previous night and they had just discovered it this morning. I was taken aback and asked for more details. It turns out that my parents had initially been open to the idea of Kevin and his girlfriend moving in, but they hadn't anticipated how financially draining it was going to be. Kevin's girlfriend, who was pregnant, had a big appetite due to her pregnancy, and my dad complained that she would eat up everything. My parents had not expected how expensive it would be to completely provide for an extra 2 adults in the house. When the bills started piling up, my parents asked Kevin and his girlfriend to contribute to the grocery bills and other expenses. But Kevin and his girlfriend refused. They argued that it wasn't fair to expect them to pay for anything, especially since the terms had not been discussed beforehand. They had moved in with the expectation that they would live there rent-free and without having to pay any bills. When my parents pointed out that they were struggling to manage expenses for everyone, Kevin tried to reason with my parents that as their son they should be helping him out without any complaints. Apparently the fight between the 4 of them escalated, and my mom, in a fit of anger, called Kevin's girlfriend a gold digger, for staying with them for free. This apparently has led to Kevin and his girlfriend moving out. Kevin even left a note saying that he was done with my parents forever. Since then, my mom has tried to get in touch with him and his girlfriend to apologize, but they have ignored all her calls. Amidst this chaos, my dad decided to reach out to me for help. He asked if I could get in touch with Kevin to check on him and see how he was doing. I told him that I would try my best since even me and my brother were not on exactly good terms, but then my dad made a shocking request. He told me that he and my mom had discussed and that they wanted me to come back home. Curiously, I asked him why they would want that since they had just kicked me out 3 months ago. My dad pointed out that if I moved back in, I could start paying them rent, which would help them manage the expenses and take care of Kevin and his girlfriend for free, and this way they would not have to pay for anything. Dad even had the audacity to suggest that I could just sleep on the couch in the living room since my old room had already been converted into a nursery. When I heard this, I just shook my head at the absurdity of it all. After being kicked out of the house to make space for Kevin and his new family, My parents now wanted me to come back, pay rent, and essentially live on the couch. I was so pissed that I told my dad outright that I would never be moving back in with them. I told him that he and my mom deserve to be cut off from their children, and they should be ashamed of themselves for even suggesting to me something as ridiculous as this. Am I the a-hole for refusing to move back in with my parents? Update 1. I'm pleased that everyone sees that I'm not the one to be blamed and finds my parents' sense of entitlement amusing. I am glad that I have Nate with me because I don't know what I would have done, had he not been in my life. After the conversation with my dad, I did call Kevin to check in with him since I was worried. He has texted me saying he's busy right now but will call me back soon, so I will update here once I have had a talk with him. Update 2. So I spoke with my brother and discovered there were additional issues between my mom and his girlfriend that my dad hadn't mentioned earlier. It turns out that my mom would criticize Kevin's girlfriend constantly, making derogatory comments about her appearance. She would interfere with how the nursery should look and what baby clothes to buy. Our parents even had an argument with Kevin and his girlfriend over the name they had picked for their baby. Our parents thought it was too simple and insisted they pick a name from my father's side of the family. When Kevin's girlfriend refused, my mom yelled at her, saying she should be more respectful and learn to make decisions with the family. Hence, when the big fight occurred, Kevin felt it was crucial for him and his girlfriend to move out immediately for her mental well-being. They're currently staying at one of his friends' places, and Kevin assured me that they're managing. He also admitted that I was right about our parents' mistreatment all along and apologized to me, saying he should have listened to me sooner. I will admit I did feel a bit better hearing my brother say that. However, I don't think that just one apology is going to fix everything. The only reason my brother finally saw the truth was because our parents treated his girlfriend the same toxic way they would always treat me. Update 3. Thank you all for supporting me over the past few months. I am thrilled to share that my admission to a local college has been finally confirmed. Nate and I are excited to start this new chapter together. Thanks to him, I've managed to save up a significant amount of money, so I'm now planning to move into a small apartment with a roommate. For everyone asking, Kevin and his girlfriend are doing well. My relationship with my brother has also improved significantly since we both decided to cut off our parents. Today, I feel grateful that my parents kicked me out for my brother. It gave me the push I very much needed to get away from them and focus more on doing something for myself.